My book, The Spirit of Work, Timeless Wisdom, Current Realities, is now published. By interweaving science, business, and sacred texts from the world's great spiritual traditions, The Spirit of Work offers a high-level but approachable way to view and structure work from individual, community, and institutional perspectives. As part of the book's reach and outreach, I will be adding some solo podcasts and interviews with authors who write to build healthy workplaces, to give you a taste of how the book's concepts can enhance your workplace experience. To get to the Spirit of Work links and purchase from online stores directly, click on the online store of your choice from my website, which is shiftworkplace.com/the Spirit of Work. Make sure you put hyphens in between the words the Spirit of Work to ensure the correct URL comes up. So that's shiftworkplace.com/the Spirit of Work with hyphens. And that's how you'll get to your goal. Looking forward to your feedback. Hello, Culture and Leadership Connections podcast listeners. I'm really happy to introduce to you today Doni Aldine, who is a very accomplished media professional. She is a globally mobile Afro-Latina and first-generation American who, by age 19, lived in and identified with 7 cultures on 5 continents. Pretty impressive. As editor-in-chief for Culture's Global Multicultural magazine, Doni is passionate about creating community for cross-cultural populations. She has extensive global experience in communications, media, and marketing for organizations, has presented around the globe as keynote at conferences, universities, and media outlets, as an expert focused on communications, entrepreneurship, marketing, branding, and cross-cultural identity. Doni also developed university curricula for global culture identity and is on faculty in journalism and media communication at Colorado State University. Welcome, Doni.
Hi, thank you. It's a pleasure to be here.
I'm really glad that you could make some time in your schedule. I understand you're in Colombia right now.
I am. I just arrived. Colombia, South America. It's so funny. Sometimes people say, they come up with all these states. Colombia, Michigan. Now, I don't even know all the places Colombia are. And I say, no, South America.
Yeah, it didn't occur to me to say any American spot that might be named Colombia. I immediately thought it was South America.
Awesome. I'm glad to hear that.
So please tell the audience a little bit about who you are, sort of from a personal perspective.
Okay. So I am Trinidadian, Costa Rican. So I'm really, in essence, South American and North American. My mother is from Trinidad and Tobago. My father is from Costa Rica. I was born in New York City and at age 2 weeks traveled to Trinidad. And my first accent was Trinidadian. So I was there until I was 4 before I went to Spain. And there's many trips and distinctions after that, of which I'm very proud and actually leads to the basis of what I do today. So my background is in media, marketing, and multiculturalism. As you stated, I'm very passionate about those things. And it's interesting growing up that way. And because of how I sound, and I sound this way to you, like someone from the US, and usually someone, with a very standard US dialect. And it's really interesting to speak with people because even if they know my background, they always forget because to their estimation, don't have any kind of accent. And every once in a while, something will pop up and they'll say, "Where was that from? Why do you sound like that?" And I just chuckle inside. It just depends on to whom I'm speaking. And sometimes if I'm tired, anyway, that is my background. That's what makes me passionate about what I do. I did live in South America, Central America, North America, Asia, Europe, did not live in Africa. And there's so many people, 328 million people live outside of their passport countries as of 2018. I haven't looked up the more recent numbers, but I know between 2015 and 2018, it grew exponentially.
Where did you find that great stat?
Oh, I'll have to look. It's in my materials. I think it's a UN stat.
Oh, yeah. Mm-hmm.
Yes.
That makes sense.
Yes, we check that all the time. And, unfortunately, I know this is going to date the podcast, but with what's happening in the Ukraine right now, we can see how some of that happens, right? Like people hear that you grew up internationally and they always think privilege, or I shouldn't say always, many people. And it took me a long time. Just like you said, the first thing you thought of was South America. It never occurred to me that people would think I was, going to Colombia, Missouri or something like that. Same thing with growing up internationally. It never occurred to me that people would have a certain picture of what that looked like for them. And so for me, I always mention, hey, you never know what that looks like. People could be migrants, immigrants, refugees. They could be international business kids. They could be missionary kids, third culture kids, which is what I'm called. And that's when you grow up globally. Grow up meaning in your formative years before the age of 18. And it's typically because of your parents and what your parents' occupation is. So there's so many people in so many different ways to grow up globally. Some of them privileged, some of them not so. And that's what I like to explore. And that's what really has made me who I am today.
Oh, that's great. Well, we talk on this podcast quite a bit about third culture kids and also about all the other categories of growing up internationally that you mentioned, because we've had people that are refugees on the podcast and people that have been refugees in their own country. So there are lots of interesting dynamics that happen when you move to another place. So how is it, this is the burning question that's come up so far, how is it that you were in so many different countries as you were growing up? What did your parents do?
So it's interesting. Mine is a little bit of everything. I'm outside of the box, the third culture kid box. This is the class I teach at university. It's called Media and Global Culture Identity. And the traditional definition of a third culture kid, as you mentioned, you've had them on the podcast and you talk about this, is time and place, right? And because of your parents' career. So formative years, globally, and because of his career. And within that, the overreaching umbrella for a third culture kid is cross-cultural kids. So that's anyone who has spent meaningful time in another culture. So even minoritized people in a specific majority culture are cross-cultural, right?
Exactly.
TCK is a subset of that. Well, for me, when you look at those subsets and all the subcultures that come under CCK, some of them are educational TCKs, some of them, as we mentioned, international business kids, civil service brats, et cetera, et cetera. For me, I crossed a number of those. So I went to college in Germany for about a year, not for my full college experience. My parents, as I told you, are from Trinidad and Costa Rica. So there are two reasons right there. The schooling was the third. Another reason was my mother's job. She, at some point, was in the Air Force, and I got to go to Turkey for that. So there's a number of reasons. And it's interesting because when I started Cultures Magazine, which really focuses on the in-between spaces, the people who straddle culture, race, ethnicity, nation, or location. So all of the subsets that we've been talking about. And that in-between space is one where this and that, either or, but no one really fully understands you. So you have this breadth of understanding, but the people in your world or the people around you have a very truncated understanding of who you are. And so that's how Cultures was formed. And that is because I, even in the TCK world, am pretty much an anomaly. Many people fit in one area or another of why they traveled, and I fit in a number of areas. And what's interesting about that is those numbers are growing in terms of people who have a number of different ways. Let me give you an example. If you even think through to Barack Obama, I think under TCK alone, there are 13 subsets, and I fit about 10 of them. And Barack Obama fits about 9. And I always get that backwards. Maybe he fits 10 and I fit 9. I always forget that. And I always look it up and I still forget it. Anyway, he, however, if you remember, or for those of you who don't know, grew up in Hawaii. His parents were from Kansas, or his mother is, I believe, Kansas, somewhere in the Midwestern United States. And his father is from Kenya. So he's mixed race, multi-ethnic. Also growing up in Hawaii is a whole different situation. He also went to school during his formative years in Indonesia. And then he went to mainland US for college. So all of those things, and even his work in Chicago, really create an ultimate dimension. The dimensionalities within TCKs are really important because it gives you better insight into who that individual is. So that multi-dimensional piece, the dimensionality of being TCK is very important. And I think as the world becomes more global, there are more people like me who have these many dimensions. And so I think it's important that there's a space that understands who they are.
Awesome. So can you share a little bit about your childhood? What's an incident from your childhood that stands out because you think it was formative for you? I'm sure you have lots of them. Can you pick one or two?
I will pick one, and I actually tell this story very often. And this is one where I was a military brat. So I was a military brat in New Mexico. I want to say Clovis, but it was actually White Sands, New Mexico. And also, as I mentioned, in Turkey. So my teacher came in one day and said, of course, we're on a military base, is everyone going to be in school next semester? And I remember I must have been like 8. I remember I looked around, and by this point, I mean, I started traveling at age 2 weeks. So I was a veteran of travel and not a big deal to leave places. But being on a base was different because here's other people who also traveled and understood what that was like. I looked around the class and I remember internally just smiling, and that turned into an external smile. And I thought to myself, all of my friends will be here next semester. That just pleased me for whatever reason. And for whatever reason, I still remember that to this day. Well, by not even the end of the school day, not only was I not in class, I wasn't even in the state or in the country. I was in another country by the end of the day. So little did I know I was the one that wasn't going to be there. I was the one that was gone.
So how was that formative for you?
I find it interesting that I remember that it's so poignant in my mind. But I think it was starting a legacy of me being the one who was gone, right? And for TCK there's so many things it's about. But one of the things I think is that you're constantly leaving. I think people assume that you feel like you'll be left. And someone said that to me the other day. Actually, a guy I was dating, he's like, I'm not going anywhere. I was like, I don't know why you keep saying that to me. I never thought you were going anywhere. But the danger is that I will go. That's what you should be focusing on, because that's what's more comfortable. That's what I'm used to. I'm used to being the one who leaves, not necessarily that people leave me. So I think that might be why that memory is so poignant.
Interesting. What about as a teenager, something that stands out?
As a teenager, oh, good Lord, you're digging back. Oh, do you know how old I am? You're digging way back. Okay, teenager, let me see. Okay, this one is interesting. Oh gosh, I don't even know if I want to say this out loud. I don't know how this will be perceived. So I had a conversation the other day about, again, I teach at university, so with one of our students, and we were talking about how the world works, and we're talking about the work world and politics, business politics, and what that looks like, because that's one of the things I really wish someone would have given me a heads up about before I started my career.
We all wish someone would have done that. Who sits you down and says, okay, here's workplace politics. Let me explain what to watch out for, but it should happen.
Yes. Well, and it's also difficult because it's so different. And I mean, the foundation of it is the same everywhere, but the actual execution of it is so different in each place, right? But I am that person. I try to give my students a heads up without making it too concrete, because they may not understand, especially if the execution is different in where they're going. So anyway, one of my former students is doing really well in her position. And I said, and you're very attractive. So blah, blah, blah. I went on with my sentence. Well, I remember, and she's blonde haired, blue eyed, very attractive, very smart, very go-getter type person. And she, I think, was a little offended. Like, do you think I got here because of how I look? And I didn't take offense to it, because I can understand her feeling that way. And at the same time, I think we do need to acknowledge that beauty, and whatever the standard is of beauty, whether it's Western standards or whatever the case may be, and how you look, is part of how people get ahead. People who are able to, people who are able to transcend that, no matter what their weight, their age, their size, their skin color, are extraordinary people, right? The vast majority of us get judged on all of those things instantly, whether the person doing the judging wants to do that or not, or whether we want to be judged or not. And how that ties back into high school is I was manning the ballot box for student council, and people were coming and voting. And it turns out I became a write-in candidate for homecoming royalty, right? And my lesson, that was my first lesson in politics, I think, was that, if you're fairly attractive, just not ugly, and you're in their face, you're sitting there, and they don't like what's being said or who's being offered, then you might get offered, right? So that's the memory I have. It sounds silly and trite, but it was a big realization for me, because I thought, that's so funny that so many people wrote my name in. Why? I was just sitting there, So
it is true that, visibility matters. And if people can't see you, they're not likely to choose you for something. And that's a pretty important lesson in workplace politics.
Yes.
Yeah, that's great. So you were born into a number of different groups. I mean, you have your two parents' ethnic groups. You have American culture, which I'm sure is a strong influence. You have military culture. probably spoke different languages because otherwise it would have been difficult to move through all of those countries. So there are going to be multiple affiliations that you have that you just grew into. Even if you didn't stay there long, it was still a part of your formative years. So what stands out for you as sticking with you from those groups that you belonged to as you were growing up?
So I'll give you another story. You can tell I'm a storyteller. That's how I tell. I give my answers. Culture is super important to me. And a little part of my soul dies when I don't have it. Now, as with all TCKs, or most TCKs, I shouldn't say all, nothing's ever absolute, but I love to travel and I love being part of different cultures. And I'm pretty resilient, so I can stay. I was married for a long, long time, and I lived 15 years in this little area of Colorado that's not very diverse. And, I had a great life. And right around the 15-year mark, I started to break down. And so that's what I meant about the TCKs and the things that they're good at. Resilience is one of them. But I'd never been in a place that long to realize that how I adapt would have a finite timing. Right. The other thing is before that, I had traveled extensively. So I always got a fix. I didn't realize until after that. So I'm getting my fix, seeing other cultures, could go back home, not a problem. Well, now, for whatever reason, my husband no longer wants to travel. And I'm in this monocultural place doing the same things with the same people all the time, every year, over and over. And I'm thinking, whose life is like this? Like, how can you stand this? But I'm also literally mentally and partially physically breaking down as well. I don't know if you know that I was going to give you a TCK stat, but we will leave that on the table. So it was at that point that I started to realize that culture is very important to me. And at the university one day, I said to someone said to me, why do you travel so much? And I said, because it feeds my soul. And they said, oh yeah, it feeds my soul too. And I thought, well, you must be dead inside because I've known you for 5 years and you haven't gone anywhere, right? But for me, and it doesn't matter, even if I lived in New York City or San Francisco and I had the ability to hear different languages walking down the street or see different people, have different interactions, that's enough. But that's why Colorado, because you often don't have that, I would go to extended places in addition to loving travel. So that's one big thing.
Mm-hmm. I'd say it's not the culture you're seeking, it's the newness. It's the new cultural experience, because being in the same place and doing the same things over and over and seeing the same types of people who've had a very deep experience of place without having moved around is not the same as an experience of moving regularly and frequently and having that thrill of exploring and experiencing something new and discovering the breadth of culture.
Newness is something that I do love, but I'm pretty solid that it's the culture. Even if, I've been to Colombia multiple times by now, and I go to France very often as well and see similar people. But it's definitely having the language and the food and the different pace. It's definitely the culture for me, though I love newness. So I won't say that newness isn't exciting.
Yeah, but you have multiple cultures to go back to experience in different ways.
Definitely.
So that piece about moving was really foundational to you. And there's always an influence from other things, though, too, because people who have done a lot of moving around often default saying, oh, it's the whole moving thing. It's the whole discovering new cultures thing. That's who I am. But, I don't think that's all who you are, because your parents have a culture that influences you. And I have talked to quite a few people that grew up in military culture. That's a whole culture in itself. That's influencing you for sure, right? So where would you say some of those influences are for you?
So definitely for me, it's not at all the moving. If I never moved again, as a matter of fact, I have friends now who are digital nomads, and they say, oh, wow, they love the moving. They love that excitement. And I always say, I did that growing up. I have no interest in doing that again.
Yeah.
And they ask me why I have a foundational place, because I keep a home in one area that I go back to all the time. And that's why, because for me, I need the rootedness. I know the restlessness. I know what that means. And that's why I'm so firm that it's culture that I'm seeking and not necessarily newness. I don't ever want to move again. As a matter of fact, when I got divorced, it's so funny. I didn't realize what a thing that was for me, seeking that rootedness, because we'd been married for a while and we were renovating a home, and that renovation took many years. And one day I came home and I said to my now ex-husband, can I come home and not have a wall missing? When I say many years, I was with this gentleman for more than 2 decades. So, can I not have a wall missing? So we stopped breaking down walls, but we still had to now build up the house. So the house was finally finished. It was getting decorated. And we were about 90% there. We didn't get 100% because I was tired. And I'll never forget the day I walked in. I also feel a house should stand up and sing to you when you come home. It's that place. It's your sanctuary. It's where you feel comfortable and settled. And so I walked in the door and we'd gotten 90% there, to the point where the house looked great. It was presentable. Other people probably wouldn't realize the 10% that needed to be done, but I did. And I walked in the door and just felt this rush of calm, and our house smelled good and it looked beautiful, and I had this big exhale. And I said, finally, settled. And then I had this shocked look at my face, and I looked around as if, I shocked myself. I didn't know that was something. This is a couple decades ago now too. I didn't know that was something I needed, that I was seeking, to have some settledness. I know as the years had gone by, and this is also in Golden, Colorado, that I had told you about. And as the years had gone by, I'd been getting a little more vocal about being able to be in one place and not have another house and not move again, that kind of thing. But to have my subconscious literally have a physical reaction and a verbal out loud reaction was surprising to me, because I didn't realize how important it was. Since then, I've known that being settled and being rooted is something that's important to me.
Mm-hmm. But I'm still not hearing anything about your parents or military culture. I'm not hearing anything personal here.
No, see, I think all of those are, that's a really interesting take. I think all of that's personal. And I feel like the question is for people who don't agree. One thing I've learned about myself, interestingly enough, recently, is things I don't answer are things that are just normal to me. So my parents are part of the equation. It's why I do what I do. That's also why I don't think it's the moving that's important. They are part of culture. They are what I do every day. That my father is why I'm in South America. My father died of COVID last year, and this is part of tribute to him. So I spoke German and French growing up, German in school. When I told you about university, and French, I studied for 8 years as I was growing up, because everyone I knew spoke Spanish. And I thought, I don't want to be like everybody else. I want to be different. So there's the newness as you talk about. But for my father, I always wanted to surprise him one day, just show up speaking Spanish, because that was his native language, right? And, just paying homage to who he was, because it's so important to me. It is who I am, okay? Culture to me is everything. Again, media marketing, multiculturalism, that is everything that I am. And so when he died of COVID, I started a tribute in Cultures magazine, and personally then spent most of 2021 traveling South and Central America and learning Spanish, because at that point I thought, by the end of this year, I will be fluent. And that's why I'm back. So, I apologize that I didn't give that as a direct answer. And even to what you're saying about military culture, I don't look at military culture as my culture. One story I was going to tell you is that when I first started these initiatives that I have, we had a barbecue. And my brother, who's 2.5 years older than I am, the barbecue was supposed to be for an hour. It started at noon. It was supposed to be done by 1. And all these cross-cultural people were there. But we had such a blast. We all stayed till about midnight. Okay. And at the end, we were doing some videotaping, asking people, what's so important to them about culture, and why would being multicultural be of interest to them. So my brother told his story, and all of his stories were about the military. And I remember I said to him, I was like, who are you? What are you talking about? Because for me, everything about me is multicultural. My parents are multicultural. I started this conversation saying I'm Trinidadian, Costa Rican. That is the basis of who I am. And even though I was born in the US, at 2 weeks I moved. I didn't really start understanding US culture until college, when I came back. And that was my only culture shock. So I realized that at that point, and that's where the dimensions come into play. People's dimensions are a big part of who they are. Because my brother identifies as a military brat because of his particular experiences. I lived with my family for 7 years out of my life. And in that time, I only spent a few years on military bases. And as I looked at him in disbelief, like, what are you talking about? Who are you? I realized that his experiences were very much military brat experiences. And then he also went into the military. Mine were not. And so culture is a huge part of my experience, because of where I went to for education, because of where I've lived, because of with whom I've lived, and because of the work I've chosen to do in my life. So everything about me is, I think, stems from my personal being. And I do apologize if I missed that, but I also think everyone has a frame of how they see things. So no, military culture is not a big part of how I see that, though I understand it. And multiculturalism, as I talk about my parents, when I say that, that's what comes to mind for me, not any travels or any of those things.
Yeah. So I guess what I was looking for, because I don't want you to feel like I'm forcing you into some sort of a mold, but because I had quite a few people on the podcast that grew up in military families, but they would say things like, oh, the structure or rules really influenced me, or the fact that there were so many rules is why I don't like rules now. Or they'd say things like, the fact that my mother was from Puerto Rico means that we had such a strong bond that, our family members call each other every day. And that's something that we have continued, even though I'm now so much older. So like, those are the kinds of things I was thinking of. But if that's not the framework that you're working from, it doesn't matter because I still have 3 more questions. So, which is that, as you grow older, you start to find things that matter to you and you start to associate yourself with groups that matter to you. And there are countries that you say when you're traveling, you go back to on a regular basis. And those might be the ones that matter to you and that have influenced you. I don't know. But also teaching at a university, being an editor of a magazine, all of those things also influence the way you see the world and you frame the world. So what would you say some of your influences are now?
I think my influences still are those from my childhood and growing up in different cultures and loving those cultures and experiencing those because I bring those to the university.
What did you adopt from those cultures? So I'm going to give you an example. So when I lived in Japan, I adopted a way of greeting people that I'd never done before. And I continued to use it even though it was 20 years ago. I have experience with a lot of Persian cultures and the way Persians greet each other and speak to each other in the beginning of a conversation and the way they end a conversation is something I do now everywhere, no matter who I'm talking with or what culture they are. I just grew it into what I do. So what's grown into you? Because it's easy to talk about it in a general way, but what's grown into you personally?
So again, I would say that often people expect my answer to be a certain way, and I'm just not that way. The only thing I could say that has grown into me is that I adopted my own way of being. And that is very much why I do the things I do now in a quest for understanding, because it's frustrating to feel like you're never understood. The other day on a podcast, I was talking about language. And this is one of the things I think I've developed from all of that. So you're talking about a way of greeting and that kind of thing. And I think I took those and I made them into something, even though I didn't know I was doing it at the time. I realize now that's what I did. But I was talking about whenever I'm in an international space and I hear other languages, I just have this international accent that comes out. And I was trying to think of an example to give them on the podcast, and I couldn't think of it at the time. But I'll say, okay, so in Germany, they'll say something like, the word I'm thinking of is eh, right? So in Trinidad, it's like eh. And in Germany, gosh, why can I not think of it? It's
yeah.
Yeah, thank you. Yeah. So yeah. And then in, let's say Colombia, it's ACS, I don't know. But for me, I like mix all of those together and I came up with a new thing. And that's what I say whenever I hear another language. And none of those languages, even the ones I'm talking about, let's say I'm in a Thai salon and they're speaking Thai. And all of a sudden I come out with my international accent, with my international words that I made up.
So what is this word that you made up?
That's what I'm saying. I can't think of an example right now because I'm not in the moment, because I don't do it on purpose. That's the thing. It just happens. And so I think that's why when I try to give someone the example, none of the words come, right? But they are similar to the ya or the eh or no or, whatever. And here's the funny thing. Everyone always understands when I do it.
Because you're picking up on that one piece in the conversation where people have a vocal thing that they default to whenever they're thinking about something.
Yes.
So you're picking up on it and you invent one that shows that people identify with it anyway because they know what it is, whether it makes sense in their language or not. And you've made it up. They don't know that.
Yes.
They just experience it that way. Interesting.
And I say it with some kind of accent. My designer the other day said to me, she's from Mexico. And she's like, yeah, you speak Spanish. She said, you don't have an American accent. Your Spanish sounds good, but you have an accent and I can't place it. And we laughed also because I said, it's my international accent. My experiences with things like food are so different than other people's. And it's really interesting.
Well, they would be, because you always modify stuff. Nobody takes anything and just does it exactly the same way. So that's just what happens to people. That's why people talk about folk music, for example, is some folks sing it this way and some folks sing it that way. And that's just what happens. Things transmutate over time, which is why culture is always fluid. But let's go to a time when you were aware that what you understood to being normal was not normal. You did mention one where this idea that people travel is normal for you, and it seemed really weird that people say, oh yeah, traveling is really important to me, but you've never known them to travel anywhere. So that could be a sense of culture shock. But you also mentioned coming back to the United States and going to college there was kind of a culture shock. I don't know if you want to elaborate on any of those or if there's a new one that comes to mind, but a time when you felt you had a sense of cognitive dissonance, you had a sense of shock where you just went, whoa, this is not how everybody else thinks or does things.
Right. Well, I don't think travel is normal. I think it's getting normal now. I think it's an aspiration for many people. And
yeah, but your own reaction, not somebody else's. I mean, sometimes you go somewhere and you just go, wait a minute, how did this happen? I had a cultural shock experience. It occurred to me now that I'm thinking of with a friend of mine. I was friends with her for quite a few years. She's passed away since, but we were going to a conference together on a plane. And she's from the Northwest in the States, and she's Black. And we did a bunch of projects together. I'm not Black, and I grew up in Canada, and we both lived in different countries. And we were sitting there in the plane talking about our favorite children's stories. And I said, oh yeah, my favorite one when I was growing up was Little Black Sambo. And she looked at me, she said, that is such a racist story. How could you even say that? And I said, wait, I thought it was a story about a little boy and tigers and making pancakes. And she said, no way. And she expelled the whole thing out to me. And I was in complete shock. I said, oh my God, I didn't even know this is a racist story. I was growing up with this racist thing that I didn't even realize that's what it was. And I had a total culture shock moment right then and there, right? So that's just one example. I don't know.
So yeah, the reason that going to university was a shock, people often say to me, just same experiences with your friend. Oh, because I went to what's called a PWI, or predominantly white institution, actually, that I teach at now. And they say, oh, was it all the white people that gave you culture shock? Because when you look at me and you hear me, people assume I'm African-American, and they make a lot of assumptions about what that means. And when people hear different parts of my experience, they make assumptions about what that means, because everyone looks at the world through their lens, right? And it's interesting because I say no. It wasn't the 20-something thousand white people at the university. It was the 200 Black people.
Yeah.
And it's because most of them were African-American, and African-American culture is very much a culture. It's not a race. Even all of that is all, made up, their social constructs anyway, but it's a distinct culture that I did not know about, that I didn't know what the workings were. I actually just spoke to a president at the UC yesterday who knew me as a student. She was a director when I was a student. And she said, oh, you had a hard time. And I said, what are you talking about? I don't remember having a hard time. Again, difference in memory. And she said, oh, yes, I remember that you'd come into Black Student Services and the students would be complaining about something. And you would say, let's come and talk to me. I don't understand. Like, why are they complaining? Why don't they get up and do something and get on? And she said, you get on your soapbox. I'm like, yep, that sounds about right. I'm thinking, but I didn't have a problem. And she said, they would look at you like you're crazy. I'm like, no, I didn't have a problem. So her perception was that I had a hard time, I guess, because I didn't fit in. But my perception was, wow, these people are very different than I'm used to, because I'm used to different Black people, right? And it was just an education. Every country is different. Every culture is different. And people see you and they expect you, if you look like them, you have that visual diversity, to be what they expect. And that's why I focus on hidden diversity and trying to find out what people are telling me first, rather than telling them who I think they are, because I don't know their experience. I don't know their background. I don't know the nuances that they all put together to become who they are. We all do it. We all default to thinking we understand. And I research this. So I really have to pay attention. Okay, am I telling someone who they are, or am I understanding who they are? And I do my best to understand how they see the world, because that's what matters in terms of their identity. That was my culture shock.
Yeah, it's a similar culture shock to interviewed Wanda Costin, who is a dean of business in a university, has been in multiple universities. And so she's a Black family, grew up in the military and spent a significant amount of time in Germany and then came back to the United States. And so when she came back from Germany, she spoke German fluently and she had a German accent. So she's a Black woman with a German accent, had a lot of culture shock fitting in with the Black community there.
Oh, yeah.
So yeah, she said
to me, that's awesome that she had the accent, because I feel if I didn't have an accent that could fit in, I'd have an easier time because I'd get a little bit of a pass, right? They'd say, oh, well, we know that you're different. But instead, people just think I'm strange because they assume I'm going to be like them. But I can only imagine what it was like for her having that accent and trying to fit in, especially any time before recent years. It was not widely known or accepted.
Totally. Coming to the end of the interview, I wanted to say when people ask you to speak or they hire you for something or they want you to work on some kind of communications piece, what brings out the best in you? What do you need to be at your best?
That's a very interesting question, because I think I'm so used to adapting so many environments, which is also what makes me such an anomaly. But I think being with people who really try to be empathetic and really try to understand, and they're engaged and interested in what I have to say. And I think I'm good at cultivating that interest for people. And I'm great at reading people. Some people say that I'm scary with that. I've had to deal with that too. So I try to tone it down, but I really read the environment in the room. And I've definitely, one of my TCK traits is I've learned how to look like I'm not paying attention, but be paying keen attention and react accordingly. So I do my best to try to make others feel comfortable so then they can hear the story. And it doesn't work all the time. There's certain populations that I've gauged, I won't say which, that have a harder time with it. And it would be shocking. It's the population you would think I'd be the most relatable to. But yeah, I think when there's a room of multicultural people or people who are open to different cultures, that's when I'm most at my best, because they tend to be the most open and they can suspend their belief for a little bit and have a little more empathy to things that they're not used to.
So here's your soapbox moment. Anything you want to promote?
Oh, well, of course, like I said, everything I do and all I'm about is about cultures. And we have a cultures media network that really is committed to uplifting and celebrating cross-cultural identity so everyone could feel like they matter. For those in-between spaces, the people who are cross-cultural, they straddle cultural, race, ethnicity, nation, or location, we try to provide a sense of belonging and a place to call home. So whether that's in podcast or video or print publication, we're read and seen in about 208 countries and territories. And last year we had the pleasure of being in front of more than 5 million people. And I would love to tell the cross-cultural stories of people. Even actually, I'd love to hear yours just in talking to you. I'd love to hear more about how some of these questions apply to you. And we give features on people like that so that we all can see the differences in how we grew up and how we might be thinking and what that dimensionality does for each of us and how it adds a little bit of spice to our world. And so you can find that at culturesmag.com. Go ahead.
I was going to ask you that. You can find it at, can you just spell that out for the listeners?
Yes, I can. It's culturesmag.com. So plural without an E. The missing E stands for the hidden diversity of the population. So CULTURSMAG, culturesmag.com.
I see. So culturesmag.com. Got it. That'll be in the show notes too. And you provided some other contact information so people can get in touch with you. So is there anything else you'd like to say?
No, it's been really interesting. I loved your questions. I loved, even though we weren't talking about you, I learned a little bit about you and that piques my interest always, always, always. I love people's stories. So thank you. Thank you for the opportunity.
Thank you so much for agreeing to be on the podcast and for your interesting answers and your interesting life. It's just wonderful to celebrate people's voices and hear what they have to say.
Thank you so much. I love what you do.
Well, it's a mutual admiration fan club.
Thank you. Awesome.
Doni Aldine is passionate about creating a sense of belonging for people from cross-cultural and third culture backgrounds. Her experience as a TCK, or third culture kid, was born out of being in a military family, the intercultural and interracial marriage of her parents, and her mother's career. From this mixture, combined with constant moving and traveling, Doni has developed both a strong sense of multicultural identity and a feeling of home as sanctuary and place of safety. She uses her insights and experience as a professor of journalism and media communications at Colorado State University. Do you have a network of friends you could send this episode to? Share the Culture and Leadership Connections podcast episodes on your LinkedIn, Facebook, Twitter, and Instagram, and tag me, Marie Gervais, on your post. You will be sent a link to download our very delicious Culture and Leadership Connections cookbook as a thank you for helping us spread the word. Thank you for joining us. And may Culture and Leadership Connections continue to guide and inspire your day. Hey, podcast listeners, help us reach our goal of 1,000 downloads per episode by going to followthepodcast.com/culture and leadership. That's followthepodcast.com/culture and leadership. If you type that into your browser and you use the and sign, not the word and, culture and leadership, it will automatically adjust to your phone, and then you can follow and rate. So followthepodcast.com/culture and leadership. Thanks in advance for following and for reviewing.